3 deaths of Japanese generals and 3 end-stage patterns of diseases of VPT energy and geometry, pathophysiology, and psychology interpretations, number 1472, VPT Sharp 033, December 20, 2025, Gerald C. Shu, EclaireMD Foundation Category, History, VPT Methodology, Medicine, Psychology. Preface. Outside my medical research work, I have long enjoyed reading history, literature, and philosophy. Recently, I was exposed to modern Japanese military history, and encountered the stories of 3 generals, whose lives and deaths particularly caught my attention. I began to ask myself how I could analyze their very different fates by examining their backgrounds, influential factors of military life, and individual value systems and personalities, using the research tools most familiar to me, including Viscoplastic Energy Modeling, VMT, psychology, and concepts from chronic disease progression. Based on this curiosity, I built this article in layers. I first introduce the VMT or VPT framework, then review the historical backgrounds of these 3 historical individuals, followed by the events leading up to their deaths, and finally map these patterns onto both views, psychological behavior and chronic disease end-stage trajectories. This short preface is intended to make the logic and structure of the article transparent to the readers. Introduction. In this article, I analyze 3 Japanese historical icons and military leaders, Korechika Anami, Maresuke Nogi, Hideki Tojo. I do not examine them to judge their politics or morality. Instead, I focus on their terminal decisions, because these decisions provide unusually clear examples of how a human system responds to irreversible stress. Each represents a distinct pathway of stress resolution under terminal load, integration, meaning transfer, and defensive overload. These same 3 pathways appear repeatedly in end-stage chronic disease. Although the hospital room and the battlefield look very different, the underlying stress strain, energy and system geometry can be remarkably similar. Death is often described as a biological failure. I view it differently, as the final geometry and energy state of a long-term accumulated stress-strain process. In VMT language, stress represents irreversible external reality, strain represents internal cognitive, emotional, and behavioral deformation under that stress. VMT energy is the accumulated product of stress and strain over time. The terminal state, whether observed in history or medicine, depends on whether this accumulated energy is integrated, dissipated, transferred, or trapped until rupture. Biomedicine adds the physiological substrate, including autonomic balance, stress hormone burden, sleep stability, inflammation, and metabolic regulation. Psychology adds the cognitive behavioral substrate, including reality acceptance, defense mechanisms, identity stability, emotional regulation, and attachment patterns. With this framework, I use the deaths of these 3 Japanese military leaders as reference cases, and then map each stress resolution pattern directly onto end-stage behavior in chronic disease. Framework, VMT mapping, stress, irreversible reality, defeat, terminal prognosis, organ failure, strain, internal deformation, acceptance, denial, responsibility, attachment, narrative defense, energy, stress times strain accumulated over time, terminal outcome, controlled termination, transferred closure, or overload rupture. Biomedicine mapping, key signals, sympathetic versus parasympathetic dominance, cortisol variability, sleep fragmentation, metabolic instability, inflammatory load. Psychology mapping, key functions, reality acceptance, denial, identity integration, meaning anchor stability, cognitive dissonance and defense. Case 1, Korechika Anami, responsibility integrated end-stage pattern. Background, Korechika Anami was a senior general in the Imperial Japanese Army, and served as Minister of War in 1945. He was directly involved in Japan's final decision to surrender at the end of World War II. He was widely known for his discipline, strong sense of duty, and absolute loyalty to the emperor. Events before his death. By August 1945, Japan's defeat was complete. Cities were destroyed, the military had collapsed, and surrender was unavoidable. Some hardline officers tried to stop the surrender, and even planned a military coup. Anami personally opposed unconditional surrender at first. However, once the emperor made the final decision of unconditional surrender, Anami accepted it fully. He enforced the order and helped prevent rebellion within the military. On the morning of August 15, 1945, after Japan's surrender was finalized and announced, Anami committed seppuku, a traditional form of suicide by abdominal cutting. He left a very short farewell note. Core messages in his farewell note: he accepted responsibility through self-sacrifice. He showed absolute obedience and loyalty to the emperor. He took the failure of the nation and military fully upon himself. VMT interpretation. From a VMT perspective, the external stress Anami faced was total and irreversible. There were no remaining options to change the outcome. Instead of spreading blame or defending his reputation, Anami concentrated all responsibility into himself. He did not argue, delay, or redirect the stress outward, because the mental strain did not spread in many directions. Stress energy did not keep growing. As a result, the system reached a controlled ending, rather than breaking down chaotically. Biomedicine interpretation. This pattern is similar to some patients at the end of life, who have little inner conflict. When a person reaches psychological closure, the body often shows less prolonged stress response. The nervous system may become calmer, and extreme stress hormone fluctuations can decrease near the end. Psychology interpretation. Anami's sense of self matched reality. He did not see death as escape, he saw it as the final act of taking responsibility. Chronic disease end stage comparison. This same pattern is often seen in patients with advanced cancer or irreversible organ failure, who accept their prognosis early. They simplify decisions, avoid unnecessary or aggressive treatments, complete personal and practical matters, and move smoothly into palliative care. Their disease continues to progress, but their mental suffering does not keep increasing. From a VMT view, stress energy reaches a plateau before death, instead of rising until collapse. Case 2, Maresuke Nogi, meaning transfer terminal pattern. Background. Maresuke Nogi was a famous general in Japan's Meiji era and a national hero of the Russo-Japanese War. His entire identity was built around loyalty, honor, and personal devotion to the emperor. He also carried long-term guilt over soldiers lost under his command. Think of Nogi as someone whose entire portfolio was concentrated in one asset: loyalty to the emperor. Events before his death. In 1912, Emperor Meiji died. This was not a military defeat, economic collapse, or national crisis. The country continued to function. But for Nogi, this was the loss of his core meaning anchor. The asset he was fully invested in suddenly went to zero. On the same day as the emperor's funeral, Nogi and his wife committed ritual suicide. Core messages in his farewell note. He did not frame his death as punishment for failure. He viewed his actions as loyal service rather than personal wrongdoing. His focus remained on devotion and duty, not outcome or results. VMT interpretation. From a VMT perspective, the main stress was not national failure. It was the sudden disappearance of the single structure that gave his life meaning. Nogi did not absorb this stress by taking responsibility or re-evaluating his role. Instead, he redirected the stress into attachment. He exited together with the meaning source. In financial market terms, instead of restructuring after a core holding collapsed, he chose to exit the market entirely with that position. The accumulated energy was not resolved inside the system. It was transferred outward through symbolic continuation. The ending appears emotionally calm, but it is not the same as a fully integrated closure. Biomedicine interpretation. This pattern resembles acute attachment collapse. Emotional and memory circuits dominate decision-making. Physiological stress may spike or fluctuate, rather than settle into a stable end stage. Psychology interpretation. Nogi's identity was externally anchored. When that anchor disappeared, coherence was maintained through symbolic reunion, rather than internal adjustment. Chronic disease end stage comparison. This pattern is often seen in patients whose identity is strongly tied to a role or relationship, such as lifelong caregivers or spouses. They may not fear death itself. Instead, they focus on reunion, legacy, or symbolic continuation. They can appear peaceful, but their acceptance is meaning-based rather than reality-based. From a VMT view, the system exits by transferring meaning rather than fully integrating stress and strain. Case 3, Hideki Tojo, defensive overload terminal pattern. Background. Hideki Tojo was a general in the Japanese army, and later served as prime minister during World War II. He was one of the main political and military decision-makers of the war. His sense of identity was closely tied to justifying his decisions and defending the historical correctness of Japan's actions. Events before his death. After Japan's defeat, Tojo attempted suicide but survived. He was then arrested, imprisoned, and put on trial by the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. From the time of his arrest from 1945 to 1948, Tojo continued to argue that Japan's actions were justified by the circumstances of the time and by international pressures. He never fully accepted personal responsibility for the outcome of the war. Core messages in his farewell note. He denied that the war was his personal fault. He explained the war as a product of historical conditions and global forces. He emphasized that he acted out of duty to his country. VMT interpretation. From a VMT perspective, Tojo faced severe and prolonged stress, military defeat, public condemnation, and legal judgment over several years. Instead of absorbing this stress internally, he resisted it. Responsibility was shifted outward, and his personal narrative was repeatedly reconstructed to protect his identity. Because the stress was not integrated, mental strain spread in many directions and continued to grow. As a result, stress energy accumulated without a release pathway. The end stage was not a controlled resolution. but a forced and abrupt termination. Biomedicine interpretation. This pattern is consistent with long-term high-stress exposure. The nervous system remains in a constant state of alert, stress hormones stay elevated, sleep is disrupted, and immune and metabolic systems weaken. Physical decline often accelerates when psychological stress remains unresolved. Psychology interpretation. Tojo's self-identity remained in conflict with reality. Death did not function as closure or acceptance. It was experienced as an interruption imposed from outside, while internal conflict remained unresolved. Chronic disease end-stage comparison. This same pattern is often seen in patients with long-standing denial or rigid self-defense. They may repeatedly reject medical prognosis, insist on aggressive treatments late in illness, and struggle against reality rather than adapting to it. In such cases, both physical suffering and emotional distress tend to increase near the end. The system collapses under accumulated stress, rather than reaching a peaceful resolution. A unified conclusion. These three deaths illustrate three recurring terminal pathways. Anami represents responsibility integration. Stress is absorbed, strain stops spreading, and energy reaches controlled termination. Nogi represents meaning transfer. Stress is redirected to attachment and symbolic continuity, producing emotional coherence through transfer rather than internal integration. Tojo represents defensive overload. Stress is resisted, strain fragments and expands, and energy accumulates until rupture. In chronic disease, the same three patterns appear repeatedly. Death itself is not the differentiator. The differentiator is how irreversible stress has been handled. Over years or decades, VMT helps explain why the disease end-stage suffering is not only biological failure, it is the visible geometry of accumulated stress and unresolved strain. The way a system lives determines how it ends. Disclaimer: this content is provided for educational reference only, and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article and related materials belong to the author, Gerald C. Shu.